Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Chemical Approval as a Best Practice. I'm Ed Rutkowski, Editor-in-Chief of The Synergist, the magazine of the American Industrial Hygiene Association. I'd like to thank all our listeners for attending today's event, and especially SiteHawk for sponsoring this webinar. SiteHawk is the global leader in safety data sheet and chemical data management, providing long-term compliance solutions through its market-leading cloud-based technology and world-class professional services. We have two presenters today. As the Senior Director of Product and Marketing at SiteHawk, Dave Williams is responsible for the Product Management Group and has over 20 years' experience in product marketing, digital strategy, and program development. His rich experience includes working on projects for clients such as Bridgestone Firestone, MSN, Vanderbilt University, and Google. Dave's diverse work responsibilities across various business functions uniquely qualify him to lead the team that guides the development and evolution of SiteHawk products. Joining Dave today is Joe Bosnack, Education and Support Specialist at SiteHawk. Joe has over 15 years of computer expertise, including programming and technical support, and over 11 years of computer instruction at Draughns Junior College and Kaplan University. Since joining SiteHawk, Joe has focused on customer technical support, application user education, application testing, and network support. Now I'll turn the presentation over to Dave and Joe.
Thanks so much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Williams here with SiteHawk. Joe, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having us here.
Fantastic. So we're going to jump straight in. And before we get started, we kind of want to talk about why chemical approval is important and a best practice, and the fact that it's not necessarily the answer to all of our woes, but is a vital part of any chemical safety program that you have in your facilities. So, Joe, you've been with us for about 9 years. Could you tell us a little bit about, can you tell us a story about why people want to move to a chemical approval process? What really drives folks to move to a process where they can understand better what's going on in their facilities?
Well, it's the entry point of your whole chemical inventory cycle. Everything coming on site, you're going to want to know what's coming on site to track those materials, any hazards you might be bringing. So a chemical approval process or a material approval process is that entry point where you can see what is actually coming on.
So when you started working with companies, big and small, what were the reasons that these companies wanted to move, in our case, to an electronic format for chemical approval?
Well, let me kind of break that down into like a story, or not really a story, just an experience with customers. Most of our customers, or a lot, I won't say most, a lot of our customers are coming in with nothing. I mean, that's why they're coming to us in the first place, to help them with their inventories and their chemical management. So as a practical example, a customer coming in here not too long ago had a very limited, if non-existent process going. So what we did with them, we sat down with them, we discussed what they were looking for and how to proceed from here. So we took our practices, what we do at SiteHawk, defined for them first what they wanted, any information they wanted to gather through the process. So we helped them build a form for their users to request materials from, built that electronically within our system. We then also went through and defined the process itself. Who's going to review it? Who's going to look at it? Who's going to make those determinations about that material? Define that into a workflow. I'll pull that all together into a process for them where they could, as materials came on site, they could use it at the front end. They'll go through the review process, and from there, they'll go into their inventory and they can manage those materials from there.
Well, it sounds at first blush very complicated. I think that we should probably start out and talk about what are the business reasons around why companies want to do that.
Sure. The primary thing is, workplace safety. Your employees need to be safe. They need to know what materials they're using, what hazards they may incur as they're using those materials. Other items may be regulatory compliance. You may have specific regulations. You may be a Tier 2 Form R reporter. You'll want to know those materials as they come on site. Plus also you may want to know any new regulations you may be affected against as materials come on site. And you can track that and find that out through the material approval process.
So before we go any further and talk about the other reasons, will you define for us what is chemical approval?
Chemical approval is basically taking a material or the SDS for that material and determining whether that is safe for you to bring on site and to use within your processes.
Okay. So companies have not only their local regulations, but they may have industry-specific regulations, or
they may have corporate guidelines that you may need to follow. You may have your own internal list of materials that you can or cannot use or don't want to use. You may be looking for other solutions to your problems.
Great. So the other reasons that we talk about also when we're talking about chemical approval are really as well contractual obligations. So for example, you're manufacturing a part or fabric or something that another company is going to use in their products or processes, and they have a restrictive list of items, materials that they do not want or can't have either in the facility or in their products. So certainly chemical approval can help not only catch those before they come on site, but definitely also used as an audit process for going back and showing that you have met your contractual obligations. I think the other thing that we don't necessarily think about often in EH&S is that tracking the materials that you're using in the chemicals can also lead to business innovation, really. So for example, you're wanting to become a greener company, or you're wanting to remove materials that have negative impact to the environment. Unless you have that information, it's really hard to do that. Chemical approval not only helps kind of as the first gatekeeper of your process of bringing material on site, but really helps you look at your business in a whole new way. So I think the reason that we are here today, one of the big things is, would you define for us kind of high-level overview, what's the outline for making sure that you have a great material approval process? Like, what's the main reason?
Well, you know what comes on site first for your employees. You know who's bringing it on, whether it's coming from an employee want to use a new a product for cleaning, whether it's a vendor coming on site with a new product, you'll need the SDS for that. Contractors, if they're coming in to, resurface a driveway or build a new area, your contractors are going to bring their own materials on site. You may need to approve those because they may, affect your other processes or interact with what you're currently doing on site. And that way, once you have that information, you'll know what hazards you bring in. Is this a flammable? Is it a carcinogen? Do we need special equipment to these? Do we need PPE, respirators to handle this material? Training. We're going to have to train our users in the new material, how to handle it safely, how to apply it, use it safely. Other things to think about, your existing reporting. I mentioned Tier 2 Form R before. Well, are these materials going to affect that or make you to begin reporting on those or any other type of regulation that may be there? You'll have to look at those other lists. I mean, in SiteHawk we have, over 200 regulations now that we're tracking for you. Does this material affect any of those? You need to look at that as you're bringing it on, make those determinations and why you'd use those. And then another thing you can do, you can look at materials you talked about going green. You may want to find comparable materials. Is something safer or better to use than what we're currently using within our process?
So really, chemical approval is the keystone for maintaining control over your inventory.
That's what I said. It's the front end. Everything coming in could go through that process, and you'll know what you're actually bringing on site.
Great. So what are the ways that people are actually managing their chemical approvals today?
Well, unfortunately, some of them are not doing it at all. So they don't know what they're bringing on site, and they're just hoping they catch it during an inventory. Some people are doing it manually. So they have a, employee comes in with the SDS, puts it on somebody's desk, it goes from desk to desk, and eventually someone will finally say yes, or groups of people will say yes to the process, which could be a drawn-out process, bringing those, getting that approval, even though you've been using the material or have that material on site that whole time. Probably the best way is electronics. Everything is quicker, of course. Everything's kept in one location, so you don't have to worry about losing that SDS on somebody's desk. Every step of the process, the person becomes accountable for that, so you know where your bottlenecks are through your approval process.
So if I were using SneakerNet, I was walking something to someone's desk, then it's a little harder to remember where that is, especially if you're having multiple materials come in. But in what it sounds like you're saying is that in an electronic format, that it's certainly easier to audit, certainly easier to find out where is it in the process, is it hung up, do I need to remind somebody, hey, this department is looking for this material, could you go ahead and review this?
Sure, yeah.
Great. So what are some of the challenges related to implementing a chemical approval process?
First would be buy-in from your upper management, making sure that they're part of the process, they agree to the process that you're trying to implement, whatever it is, whether it's a manual process or an electronic process, to make sure that they're on board, they're going to support you using that process. Mm-hmm. You'll have to have your other groups involved with it, whether it be, purchasing, to be part of that so they know that they can now purchase products, development, R&D, all those people that bring materials on site need to be on board and willing to use that process also. And then, of course, you have to have your salesmen, contractors, those type of people as part of this process and be willing to use it. You have the paper technology. We talked about that a little bit, manual versus electronic, which way you want to go. I'm going to push you to electronic because that's what we use, that's what we support at SiteHawk. I find it's probably better, easier, faster, more reliable. It's all out there for you, so you have a great history of everything. Through the company itself, you got to look at possibly changing policies and procedures within there, where everybody's used to just throwing SDSs on your desk as the EH&S manager. You got to send them now to the right spot. So you're going to have to train them, get them to know what processes to use to begin that process. And then keeping it up to date. Reviewers are going to change on you. You may want to capture different information within those. So you're going to have to keep it up to date once you get it started.
Mm-hmm. I was speaking with a client last week, and one of their challenges you hit on, which is, EH&S partnering with other groups, whether that's a maintenance manager or purchasing, mainly because if someone has, sometimes I call them off the ranch or P-card purchases that for materials that they are not aware actually on site, somebody needs to run down and get some oil in the vehicle maintenance shop or something like that, that's not something that's already been approved, then you end up with sometimes hundreds of new materials in a facility in an 18-month period is what we find out, right? So having those partnerships and the policy that has everybody in line and understanding what the goal is really important. So what happens if you have multiple facilities and maybe they don't all have the same process? How is that one of the bigger challenges that you hear from day to day?
Yeah, that's where you get you need your corporate buy-in. You did that upper management. If you can get it set up at a corporate level, get the corporate buy-in, they can not force, but roll it downhill to their multiple facilities. So you can use the same process. So if somebody transfers from plant A to plant B, they know exactly how to bring on a new material if needed.
Uh-huh. So I think standardization, we can all agree, is the easier, more efficient way to go. But when an organization has multiple facilities, maybe they've acquired a new plant or a new product line, and they have a specific facility based on the materials they're handling or what they're producing, how do you address those challenges from a chemical approval process?
Well, what you can do, you may have the same process, gather the same information, but your material approval process should be somewhat customizable for the location, for the group that you're working for. They may have specific circumstances. An R&D department is going to be different than, your general production floor, because they're going to bring on different things, have different hazards. So what you should be able to do within your material approval process, your chemical process, is have different workflows for that, so it can be routed to different groups as needed through that process.
Makes sense. So would you outline for us then, and then we're going to take a deeper dive into really defining what are the pieces, parts that everyone on the call today is interested in about. How do we define that chemical approval process?
Okay, what you're going to first do is figure out when you're going to use your material approval, or your chemical approval. Are you going to use it for new materials, for existing materials? Do you have special circumstances like we just talked about you may be using? Who are you going to allow to submit those? What information you're going to gather from that submission. Then you're going to have to look at who's part of your review process, who makes those determinations, yes or no, that you can or cannot use that material. How often you need to do that, what information you're going to gather from those users. You then look at, once you have those users defined, what order you're going to do those in. We can dig into that later. Once you've approved and it's gone through your process, who needs to be notified? Does it need to go out to other people? What are you going to do with that material or that SDS once you've approved it or declined it? Where does it go within your system and your inventory? And then, do you need to keep a history of that? The material's been requested, it's been approved, denied. What kind of history and tracking mechanism are you going to use with that?
I can imagine I know that we have a couple of situations where I think common for all facilities is that if there's a risk management scenario, and not only are we keeping, for instance, in the U.S., a 30-year history of materials and what areas they've been in, but this approval process and keeping that history and tracking that can help us understand how we can have process improvement, right? So thanks for giving us the overview of what should be a part of a chemical approval process, but would you do this for us? Would you jump in and talk a little bit more specifically about what situations require chemical approval?
Sure, I mentioned three basic things before. New materials, so anything new that's coming on site, you probably want to go through this process. So you can make those initial evaluations. Is this a hazard? Is it reactable with other things? Is it on a specific regulatory list? Different training, whatever you need to find out about those new materials. You then have your existing materials, something that you're currently using within the plant at one location. You may want to either use it for like reordering purposes, so use it as an inventory tracking. Yes, every time we use this material, we're going to have it go through the process so we can evaluate when we're using it again, how much. Also for existing, you may want to use it in use the chemical approval for where it's used. You may use it on the plant floor, or you may use it on, let's do it the other way. You use it on R&D, but you want to get it approved for use on the plant floor. So that may have to go through its own process that you may have to set up within the system. So you have your special requests, anything outside the normal review that you may have for your new existing. You may have, for most things, your WD-40s, that type of thing, your oils. It's going to go through a simple review of whoever, but you may have those higher risk things, those, big methyl ethyl deaths that will have to go through maybe a secondary review or to specialized reviewers to evaluate whether you can use that product.
So I think that new materials, putting new materials through chemical approval is very straightforward. For existing materials, the recommendation for best practices, you could use that information a couple of different ways. I think you already mentioned one, which is it's used in R&D. We've decided to add it to our manufacturing process. we're going to need to put that back through, even though it's already been approved for one area, put it back through the process to make sure that where it's going to be stored, there may be reactivity risk, there may be, it may change the PPE required for, or disposal type required for a particular area. So, and then for special materials, these may be the materials that actually fall outside of, they may be flagged because it's a material that the organization in general isn't, you know, for most situations, doesn't want to have on site.
Right.
Yeah. Any other special situations that you can imagine would require chemical approval?
You can do it for just about anything you're looking for. We mentioned the new, the existing, using it in different locations, or you may improve it at, if you're in a corporate environment, you may use it at one plant and need to approve it at another plant. Even though it's been approved for the corporation, you may want to bring it in somewhere special.
Makes a lot of sense. So would you do a little deeper dive on who should submit, but I want to take a quick pause here and just remind everyone that if you do have questions that come up while Joe and I are talking today, don't forget to put those into the question panel or the chat panel over there to the right, and we're going to get to as many of those as we can before the end of our time together. So Joe, who should submit chemical approvals?
Well, that's kind of a business decision. I'm going to throw it out there. It is a business decision of who gets to. You may want to have every employee to be able to bring a material in and say yes, and have them go through your chemical approval process. But you may want to restrict that also. You may want to limit that maybe department heads, supervisors, so they know what's coming on site. So, you know, every floor person cannot just go out and bring in a bottle of whatever they need to clean their product, which may not be compatible with other chemicals used or corporate policy, that type of thing. Also, you may think about contractors and salesperson. They're going to be bringing chemicals on site or possibly bringing things on site that meet the same criteria as your employees. They shouldn't be used with other chemicals you're using or may react with what you have or corporate policies not letting you use those.
So I can imagine that in some maybe single facilities or smaller organizations, every employee having the ability to submit may make more sense, whereas in larger organizations, the responsible party or the H&S manager for a single facility may really want to streamline that for themselves, and that I need to review that before we ping the rest of the folks that may be reviewing.
Right, because you want to know what's coming on site before it actually gets on site. Because if they go out, the employee goes out and grabs a bottle of whatever, and OSHA walks in the door with them, they better have that SDS for that material as they bring it on site.
Makes a lot of sense. So what information should be included in the submission?
Basically, what you'll need first, the SDS, always should be required. I've had customers that didn't make that a requirement, where the employee could say, we want to use material X, and they left it on their supervisors to obtain that for them. Best practice, I think, if you want to use that material, you better bring us the SDS, have that available for us so we can review that. Through an electronic system, you probably include the actual name of the material, the manufacturer of the material, so you know who you're getting it from, where you're getting it, how it's manufactured. Other things, where you're going to be using this material. Maybe not required in a smaller location, in a smaller facility where you have a limited amount of materials, but for a larger plant or organization, you want to know actually which facilities it's used in. Is it used in plant A, plant B, and also within the plants, is it used in department A, department B, production line, that type of thing also. Other things you can gather, and all of this is dependent on what information you as the reviewers want, whether if you want it off the SDS itself, or if you want that supplied by the submitter. You can get all your health and safety hazards. You can gather all that information from them, whether it's flammable, whether it's regulated by a specific agency. You can have them supply that information. Is there specific materials you need to use with this material, PPE information, any specific training requirements that are required for this. So just about anything you might think that you might need for your review, you could have as your submitters provide that for you. But the basics would be the SDS, material name, manufacturer, possibly where it's located.
Okay, so it sounds like it's flexible depending on your business practice, what you're trying to get out of your chemical approval process.
Corporate policies, all of that.
Right. So, you know, in an electronic system, you could also, let's say that you have a regulatory list that you want your chemical approvals to go through before they actually get sent over to a person to review, and that, you know, if someone has the SDS, they don't necessarily, you know, they might enter the name and manufacturer, provide the electronic version of the SDS, enter their task numbers, and then depend on the system to cross-reference against regulations or internal lists and either summarily approve or deny or move it to the next step, so that you're really reducing the amount of work that people are going to get downstream, right?
Right, yeah. If you have all that, you mentioned ingredient information out there, a system could actually bounce it against those regulatory lists, your internal lists, that type of thing, and actually make those determinations. Probably not the approval, but at least a denying, saying you can't use it off of because it's on this list.
Mm-hmm. Very good. So when should we be using chemical review? And I know that we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but I know that this is, of course, a business decision every organization has to make, depending on your business practices, or and we see a spectrum of stringent to a little bit looser when it comes to these things, especially for those that you mentioned earlier that maybe don't have any kind of chemical approval at all, or may not know what's on site. So when are the right times to review or put a product through a review?
Well, definitely when you first start using material. You're going to bring it on site. You don't know what it's going to do, how it's going to affect everything else within your process. So any new material should go through that, giving it a chance for your, environmental health safety departments, plant managers, department heads, be aware of that new material and any hazards, any requirements for that material. Let them know in advance so they can prepare for that material. You can do it upon ordering a material, as I mentioned before. You can use a chemical approval process for an inventory type thing. So we order material X, we've used go through our initial process, we've used all quantities of it, we want to begin using more. Doesn't need to go through another process to, yes, we're going to continue using that material, or we're going to find something else to replace it. Then also when you're going to use it in new locations. We mentioned if you're using an R&D, you decide you're going to use it on the plant floor, the production floor. Should possibly go through a process. So again, those people on that production floor or plant floor are aware that that material is going to be brought in and begin being used, so they can prepare for it.
So it may sound to some on the line today that putting a material through the review process upon every order may seem a little redundant, but I think that you kind of touched on this a little bit, is that depending on, are you ordering more, is this going to trigger you having to report this for a threshold, because of the amount that you're ordering, or is there a new SDS? And does that SDS, it may have the same name from the same manufacturer, but is the formulation the same? So you're saying that, looking and being more stringent about it, it's going to help you catch problems before they really arise, right? Right.
That way you keep your system up to date. If it is a new SDS, a new formulation for that existing dock material, you can have that in the system and update it and keep track of all your hazards.
So we've gotten through most of the outline. One of the things that I know comes up in our experience is that many organizations not only had internal approvers, but they also had external approvers, and some of the materials may be either proprietary or need to have a certain level of security around them. Is a chemical approval process typically, in your opinion, is it really more streamlined and better just in-house, or is it possible to have best practices and still use external vendors?
Oh, no, it's very easy to use external. With the SiteHawk system, I can speak specifically about, we can allow access to external vendors. You may need to include a vendor or manufacturer in that process. Where on an SDS, it may have a list of ingredients. Some may not be disclosed, or it may not have the accurate percentages of that ingredient within the material. So you can have that external vendor or manufacturer as part of that process to help you with those evaluations and supply that information through that process.
That's great to know. And so, for instance, many organizations have a product certification document form, and not only are they looking for the SDS, but they're also asking specific questions related to that. So you could just make that as a, hey, we got, someone internally may have submitted the material in the SDS, and you can add an external vendor, distributor, manufacturer, where in their part of the workflow, they can answer the questions that, beyond the SDS.
Yeah, and there may be supplemental information that they need to go with that. If you get back to the vendor or the manufacturer, they may supply tech sheets that go with that, or PPE requirements for that, specifics on, type of glove, that type of thing, as you can attach with that request also.
Great. So I think the last kind of step that we need to talk about today is the information that we should be retaining during each chemical approval process or review.
Yeah, with the review itself, of course, you're going to want to keep everything that's part of the request itself, have that information that's supplied initially. You may also want to keep track of, as the reviewer goes through it, any notes or comments they make. They may say, yes, we can only use this in situation X, Y, Z. Or they may say, yes, we can use this if we have a specific glove or a specific training is done. So you may want to keep those notes and comments available from those users. Then any specialized data that might be with the request itself. As I mentioned, there may be additional supplemental documentation that's associated with that. That can be attached. You may want to keep that with the request itself, as well as with the material as it goes through the rest of its life cycle at your facility. Another thing to keep track of, how long you want to keep track of this. Do you just want to throw it away, or do you want to keep it, as I said, with the life of the material? So you can go back, see that material when it was requested, how many times it was requested or denied, approved throughout that process.
That's good to know. And then, I think that it's especially in the day and age that we live and work in today, that it's easier to keep those longer histories and have that information to be able to slice and dice and look and see, are we making good choices? Do we need to review or change up how we might be approaching the materials we use or the processes we use to make sure that our workplace is safe? Well, thanks so much, Joe, for that information. I think that what we're going to do now is we'd love to open up the floor and talk about and answer any questions that folks might have.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Joe. Just a reminder, everyone, if you'd like to ask a question, please type it into the chat window on the right side of your screen and send to all panelists. It looks like we have about 25 minutes for questions. Here's one that just came in from Gerald. How do most organizations handle the approval of consumer products used in an industrial setting? This would include hand soaps, cleaners, et cetera.
What I've seen with everything, they're doing the same thing. As long as the SDS they have the SDS for the product, they're able to go through the same process that you may have set up. There are SDSs associated with those, so just evaluate those as needed through your material approval process.
Yeah, and I think that part of that question too is the lifelong dilemma of it's a consumer product versus a product used in manufacturing. And so when you look at those materials, of course, if it's hazardous, it certainly needs an SDS from a compliance and regulatory and safety standpoint, but the thing that should also be considered is that, for instance, on a recent inventory, we were in a facility and a consumer container of Crisco is on the manufacturing floor. So in our opinion, this material is not being used for its intended purpose, and it's not being used in a specific consumer process. So it's going to be something that may be considered to be a part of your manufacturing process. In that case, the safest thing to do is have the SDS. So I think that the workflow could be different based on where that product is actually going to be reside and used.
That's your specialization that we talked about, the different when to use a workflow, whether it's for a new material, existing material, or that special thing. You may have those consumer products in its own workflow that it can go through basic plant manager approval type thing.
Right. Great. Next question.
All right. Thanks. This is a question from Chantal. How is approval for mixtures handled?
Well, it can be the same way as a pure substance. With a mixture, you should have some sort of breakdown on the SDS of the ingredients within there. So your reviewers can evaluate those as it goes through the process. If you need additional information or if it's not disclosed on there, we talked about being able to get your external vendors or manufacturers as part of that review process, so they can add more information about that to help you with your determinations. Also, you can have your requesters supply that additional information, the ingredient SDSs, to this. So if there's not testing or evaluations of the mixture as a whole, they can at least evaluate the individual ingredients as they go through that, as you go through the process.
Great.
Thanks. Thanks, Joe. The questioner just chatted an additional comment for your consideration. Said she's using several different chemicals that are being pre-mixed off-site. I don't know if that changes your answer at all.
If they're pre-mixed off-site, there's probably not testing or evaluation of the material as a whole, so that's where you would probably need the individual ingredients, SDSs, to evaluate that material.
Okay, thanks. Next question, do you know if companies use GHS for chemical review as well as occupational exposure limits?
You can use GHS is kind of the standard that we're all going to now, so using that as part of your process, you're going to want to evaluate to this and see whether it meets any of those hazards. So you can look at those GHS documents, see if there are GHS specifications, whether it is, I forgot all the little icons, whether it's the dead fish or the pictograms and everything. So yeah, you would evaluate to GHS.
Right. So I think the format is GHS. So that could be OSHA 2012 or WMS 2015. But that GHS really is defining what is the format of the document, what are the sections, and what should be in each section. Whereas the information contained in the section can be used certainly in an approval, if it's requested or entered by the requester, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Here's a question from Kimberly who says, we may have missed it, but is there a chemical tracking mechanism that can tie directly to a specified regulatory list that would help us track quantities of, say, Tier 2 chemicals?
Well, yeah, hopefully within your chemical approval system, you would have some way where you can evaluate that material against Tier 2 to see whether that is a Tier 2 chemical. Have a quantity within the process itself, so you know how much material you're bringing on site, and that should be part of your process, especially if it's electronic.
Yeah, if you're using electronic process, and you know, for this question, I think that's where this question is really coming from, is that the first step in your workflow for your chemical approval should be that this material, the requester has entered the CAS numbers, maybe the quantities, and then you have a pre-selected set of regulatory lists, whether that's local municipalities, federal government, industry, or your own internal lists of materials. And at that point, the system, like SiteHawk, should really look at what is it that, does it fall on one of these lists? And if it does that mean that it is categorically denied? And the very important step in this process, and it's a great question, because if it does that, then you really reduce the amount of work that is put on the rest of the reviewers. You can stop it before it moves on. You can flag it for review by whoever is the owner of the chemical approval process for a facility or an organization.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Next question is from Edward. Should you also ask how the material is to be used?
Yes, I would say yes. You whether you should or not, you can. Again, yes.
I will concur with Joe in that, yes, you should be asking what that's going to be used for. And more than likely, because you're defining where it's going to be used, that's going to start narrowing down the information. So if you're using something in the paint shop versus assembly, then you're going to start narrowing down that information. But, you know, off-label uses for products are certainly going to impact the type of hazard or the type of PPE or precautions that you're going to need to take. So again, depending on how stringent your chemical approval process is, and you know, we recommend a chemical approval process is a best practice for workplace safety, but the more information you have, the better decisions you're always going to be able to make.
Okay, here's a question from Patrick. Can you comment on the expected time required to complete this approval process?
With an electronic process, I can speak better than a manual. Of course, manual may be a slow process because it goes from desk to desk and may sit there for a set number of time. But with an electronic process, it can, since it's all saved in one location, with the SiteHawk system, each reviewer is notified through that. So the request gets right to the reviewers immediately via email within SiteHawk. So they have quick access as soon as they're checking their email. So the time frame for that would go from minutes to hours as opposed to possible days and weeks if it's walking around on a sneaker net.
Okay, here's a question from Donald. When approving a new chemical, must all the workers in the area in which that chemical is being used be notified that the chemical is being used?
Yes. So it is, at least here in the U.S. and most countries under their agencies, respective agencies, it is the responsibility of the EH&S manager, area manager, to notify employees, train them if there are any differences in PPE usage, precautions, hazards, any of the information that has changed from the last time that they have been inside that particular area.
Okay. The next question, can you comment on upstream manufacturers' willingness to provide direct data entry to the approval solution? Do you have documented participation rates, for example, and turnaround times for response?
So I'll take a leap here on kind of translating this question. So it sounds like that, let's take, for example, the use case that we talked about before, where you have an outside reviewer that may need to either provide additional information or provide further context around a material that's in the middle of a chemical approval process. Materials come in, and then a part of that material process, we're sending out information to that's going to be completed so that it can be reviewed and then either ultimately denied or approved. So as far as statistically for outside reviewers, if reviewers, depending on how you have them set up in an electronic system, they either they're giving opinion or they're filling out content. You can either say yes, they have denial right or approval right, or I just need additional information. In the case of they have approval and denial, the statistics are far higher. I don't know if I could, I wouldn't want to give a specific number right now unless I went and got the specific information. Don't want to misquote today. But then those that are asking for supplemental information, it then is up to the end user who, the final approver who, are we going to move ahead with the approval without the information?
And just to kind of follow up on that, the reviewers that you sell, if you have an external reviewer, you're probably going to have some sort of relationship with that manufacturer first if they're going to supply that information, and you're going to make them part of your review process. So if you're, the big example we have is paint, where they don't disclose all the ingredients or the formulations specifically within the paint. So our clients themselves already have a relationship with those vendors for their paint. So they'll be able to very easily get those people in there. If I'm just buying, product off the shelf and I'm saying, well, I'm going to have info at whatever company as part of my review process, yeah, that's probably not going to work very well.
Right.
Okay. Here's two questions from Alexandra. Specifically pertaining to SiteHawk, how are duplicates of identical SDSs handled? And also, does SiteHawk have a feature that notifies users if a chemical violates certain regulations?
Okay, that's a great question. So you kind of understand, kind of set up this question, is that SiteHawk actually uses a multi-tenant shared database model. So what that means is that, say that Joe has WD-40 that's Prop 65 approved, and I have WD-40 in a 12-ounce aerosol can that's Prop 65 approved. If Joe gets a newer, more updated SDS for that exact same product, and we have a method by which, whether it's not only professional review, but also via our indexing policies, we check for a duplicate. If it is the exact same, then both of us would keep the most current SDS. If Joe has a newer one, that SDS comes in, then I can accept that update, and I don't actually have to go out and get the newest SDS. In the case of, and it happens quite often, and I think that this, the listener who has asked this question clearly knows what they're doing, has been in this industry a little bit, because although the regulations are pretty straightforward about here are the sections in the SDS, here's what needs to be in each section, the challenge is that a lot of manufacturers basically author and create those documents in different ways. Sometimes those changes can literally be from one product for the same company to another product. So the challenge then becomes, is this the exact same product? Is it not? SiteHawk actually leverages a tool that enables users, our companies, to say, hey, these two are the same for me. I'm going to make sure that I get to pick the material and the SDS that is the product that I have. Because although the documents are very similar, they quite often are not. And then what was the second part of that question, Ed?
It was the SiteHawk have a feature that notifies users if a chemical violates certain regulations.
Yeah, we do have within SiteHawk, as I mentioned, a regulatory list of over 200 different regulations that we're tracking within SiteHawk. So what we'll do is we'll take your materials, bounce them against those regulatory lists by cast number and chemical category to determine which of your materials are subject to those or on those regulatory lists. Now, through the material approval processes specifically, you're going to be able to take that same type of thing, entering in those CAS numbers, balance it against those regulatory lists, and make those determinations on the front end.
Okay. Here's a question from Amy. Does SiteHawk have a tool for inventory control, such as barcoding containers?
Absolutely. In fact, we have various kinds of inventory control from a reconciliation. So, for instance, you want to make sure that you have the appropriate SCSs for the materials that you have in an area. That's Veriscan, which actually in 2011 won an award by for Product of the Year. Then there's our Material Lifecycle Management System, which enables you to not only collect quantities on transactions, and actually a new version of that is coming out in August, which we're very excited about, and from transactional to even, max daily average for any of your, for instance, SARA reporting, anything that might trigger thresholds.
And just to jump on that, you can also have your estimates, your max average daily amount usage stored within SiteHawk, and that ties into our Tier 2 wizard, so you actually generate your Tier 2 reports directly from SiteHawk.
Okay, thanks. Next question, will this approval be required for the chemicals that are a product of an in-house process?
That's an interesting question. Joe, have you had anyone who has, they've put X, Y, and Z into a process and then the output?
No, everything we've done that way, we've either authored the document for them or it's come through our Composer product and they just automatically add that. Anything they create themselves is usually approved by default at this point. I haven't had anything that way.
I mean, it certainly could be, the same process could be applied, across areas, whether it's waste stream or otherwise.
Okay. Next question includes an acronym that I'm not familiar with. It is, do you see utilizing UNSCPC codes to help purchasing departments determine if a new product request should be routed through the chemical approval process?
Would you repeat that? I'm sorry, we had a audio problem on the side.
Sure. The question is, do you see utilizing UNSCPC codes to help purchasing departments determine if a new product request should be routed through the chemical approval process?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see any reason why not. I mean, if you're familiar with how UPCs, SKUs, how these all work, whether all through GS1, whether it's a G10, which is the identifier for the organization, and then the represents barcodes, any code or number could be used to trigger or identify that a product needs to go through a chemical approval.
Okay. Other than the SDS, what other supplemental documentation is being collected by companies during chemical approval?
A lot of companies they have their own manual form that they want to complete, so they're tracking and gathering that. You may have tech sheets that are associated with material usage of how to use that material. It could be SDSs for ingredients or components associated with those. A lot of times there may be a foreign language SDS or a non-English language SDS if you're outside of the U.S. May be associated with that. There may also be specifics about PPE. So for a glove, some materials may say you need this specific glove to use. So that information may be attached and requested.
Okay. Next question, how often do companies make changes to their chemical approval processes?
Of course, that depends a lot on the company itself. You could probably do that first with, of course, it's going to happen with a change of personnel. One of your reviewers either leaves or transfers, so you're going to have to make a change to your material approval process that way, get that new reviewer or a replacement within there. When you do those changes, you may have a change of ideas of information that needs to be collected or just the way things are displayed in the request form. So you need to make changes to your request form there or the possible workflow within there. You may think of a better way to use the process, refine the process where your original design that you thought up does not work exactly as intended. So you may want to go back and reevaluate how the actual flow goes and set that information up and redefine your process that way. So that could be, changing the ideas or refinement of the process could be daily for the first little bit that it's being used, but hopefully that should, shake out till you refine your process the way you need it. And then the only changes would be that change of personnel.
Okay, and we're coming close to the end of the hour here, so this is going to be our last question, but we're currently looking at moving to electronic chemical approval from a mostly manual process. Would you describe the time savings for approvals when going fully electronic?
Yeah, the time savings on that, of course, the manual is going to go through a process where it goes from desk to desk and may be lost on someone's desk. It goes through the process, not actually knowing where the process or the flow is or where it currently sits. With an electronic process, what you're going to be able to do is immediately have access to all of that information. So upon request, each reviewer is going to be notified that there is something to review, which is going to cut out that delay. So you're not going to have the big waits on a turnaround time to get it to those reviewers. So it's just a matter of them, as soon as they are notified, getting into the system and doing their evaluation. So the time savings go from, down to days or weeks to minutes to a matter of hours to get that turnaround and approval on that material.
And I think that the cost savings from, if you're looking at, I need to go from requesting material to I'm using it in my manufacturing process is not just the only time that is saved, especially in the electronic model, simply because understanding where that is in the process is can be pulled up immediately on demand, reminding whoever the request is with at the time that, hey, this is still there and we're looking to move that along. There's all kinds of time savings and efficiencies built in, especially in a fully electronic model.
Okay, and it looks like, unfortunately, we're out of time for today. My thanks to Dave Williams and Joe Bosnack for their presentation, to SiteHawk for sponsoring today's webinar, and to all of our listeners today. Please keep an eye out for announcements of future Synergist webinars, and have a great day.